You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and now it's time for the Paranormal Peep Show.
Hi, welcome to the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Well, I'm very pleased to say that we have Stephen Sakellarios joining us this evening. We're going to go straight into this interview. Andy's not here, so it's just me on my Todd. And we got Stephen Sakellarios, who rejoins us from previous interviews. Stephen, it's good to see you. How are you?
Very good. Great to see you again.
Cool. Well, the reason that I've got together with Stephen again is because we've been sharing a mutual interest in all things old-fashioned as such. It's actually a spillover from the previous interview where we were talking about previous lives and reincarnation, wasn't it, Stephen? So you believe that you were a guy called Matthew Whittier who was around in the 1870s, 1860s, something like that?
Yeah, he was born in 1812, so he lived all the way up to 1883. So
1883,
covered
right.
most of the century.
Wow. And so he was born in the United States, and what was his job again? He worked for a newspaper, is that right?
Yeah, he was a reporter and an author and a writer, but he did other things as well. But I mean, mainly he was an author.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I recall that. Yeah. So for anyone that wants to find out more of that previous interview, I'll put a link for those on YouTube. But search out, if you're listening on the podcast, search out on the Paranormal UK Radio website, or certainly in any of the podcasts you're listening to, the search engines of those. Search out Stephen Sakellarios, mediumship and reincarnation, I think it's called. And it's just a little interview we did last year, I think. So basically, what's been happening, I've been researching a lot of material for my book, and I found something online. You can actually get it on Amazon, and it's called People of the Other World by
People from
the Other World. That's right. And it was written around the 1880s.
Yeah, 1875. Yeah.
1875, yeah, based upon kind of newspaper reports that were sent through by this guy called Colonel
Henry Alcott.
I keep wanting to say occult. Alcott.
To see why.
Yeah. So we're going to get to that in a minute because it's very interesting. But I was just going to update Stephen and listeners on various things that have been of interest. We laid my dad's ashes to rest last week. And we've been waiting a little bit of time for the stone to be engraved. And so when they took the stone away to be engraved, it provided us with an opportunity to put my dad's ashes, who passed away last year, into the same plot where my mum's ashes are at rest, so to speak. I hate saying that word, at rest, but so we did that kind of ceremony, if you can call it that, last Friday, and we met up with various members of my family, including cousins, and I started having a meal with them at the pub, and we were talking various spooky subjects, and they told me that their mother, who passed away back in 2020, I think it was, just at the beginning of the pandemic, she passed away sadly, but she said that she was seeing people like her sister who had died sort of 40 years ago. She took her own life, her sister, unfortunately, and her name, I won't say her name for privacy reasons, but she could see her and she named her sister, and my cousins who were there, couldn't see anybody, but they were sort of like thinking, well, we know this name, it's a family name. And, and my auntie was saying that, she could definitely see all these different relatives, including her sister who took her own life. And then she passed peacefully away. So it's an interesting phenomenon. A lot of people seem to report this. If they're dying on their deathbed and they start to see visions, I suppose the everyday word would be that most people would use, they had visions and it was just the drugs affecting them or something like that. But I suspect that me and you kind of think that it's actually something a bit more...
Well, it's a little more complicated when it's somebody that they don't even know has died, that the family doesn't even know they've died, and they're seeing so-and-so, and it turns out that they had died then and nobody knew.
Yeah.
So it gets more interesting in cases like that.
Yeah. So you've had similar incidents in your family, haven't you, Stephen?
Yeah, my mom had dreams of her best college friends coming with it, telling her to pack her suitcase, and she says, I'm not ready. So toward the end, I told her if one of these ladies comes for you, go with her, because she was, we had hospice in and she was dying. There was no way she was going to recover. So she was very peaceful the last 3 weeks. So she must have had visitations, And then I've seen it with work. I used to work with elderly people, and there was one older fellow who, he didn't say anything, but he was a few days out from passing on, and he was suddenly astonished and looking up at the ceiling at somebody. And it was clear that he was engaging with someone, So I think it's actually quite common.
Yeah. I think it's typically in those cases where the person is passed away slowly and they might have been brought home to die from, like, say, a hospice or a hospital or something. Obviously, I suppose it does happen in hospitals as well. When my own grandfather passed away back in the late 70s, he was talking about that he could suddenly see poppy fields of France, and he fought in World War II and things, and he suddenly said, why am I seeing poppy fields? And I wonder if he was getting a glimpse of the other side of
Probably. But
unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to go and see him or anything like that, so there's all the stuff that was related to me. I never heard this directly. But yeah, it's interesting stuff. I mean, my brother witnessed 3 weeks before my mum suddenly passed away. He witnessed in the family home a vision, if you like, or a spectral vision of my mum, who was still alive at this point, but she came through the wall, skipping, holding her dress out, and she looked like 30, 40 years younger. And she was smiling, and he described it like seeing a silent movie. He could hear no sound, but she was skipping through the bedroom and went and passed out through the bedroom window. And he thought, what the bloody hell's going on there, sort of thing. Now, my brother's into the psychic stuff, so he kind of got an idea that something was a bit strange. He wasn't thinking he's had too much medication or anything like that. He definitely knew there was something psychic going on, and then suddenly, like 3 weeks later, my mum did pass to spirit. So
well, I think when people are getting close to death, they're kind of testing it out, going out of the body a little more,
testing their wings, so to speak. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's done on an unconscious basis, because I actually believe that my mum knew her number was up the night that she passed away. She had a feeling, I think, because I was upstairs in the spare room doing some video editing. And my dad shouted up the stairs. He said, Neil, your mum wants me to go to bed with her now because she's not feeling too well, but she wants me to go to bed with her. Now, typically my mum would go to bed about 10:30 in the evening, and my dad would stay up till about midnight watching war documentaries or football or something like that, and then finally turning just after midnight. But on this particular occasion, he shouted up the stairs. He says, your mum wants me to go to bed with her tonight at 10:30. So I said, all right. So I thought, that's really strange, Why has she said to my dad, come to bed with me now? I don't feel well, but I want you to come to bed with me. So anyway, she crawled up the stairs, and I could hear her sort of panting as she was coming up the stairs, and the room that I was in, the door was slightly ajar. So I thought, oh, well, she's always panting and breathing heavily, because she's old. So I just kind of shouted through the door, Nye, I hope you feel better in the morning. And then as I said it, I had this weird feeling inside that what I said wasn't true, or it didn't seem honest, or something didn't feel quite right about the statement I just said, see you in the morning. And it's only when I look back at it, I felt that, again, that was a psychic kind of notch or something within me telling me something was up.
You knew more than you knew.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Subconscious kind of knew what was up. And my mum's subconscious knew what was up, I think. And that was communicating, perhaps, I don't know. And then she passed to spirit maybe about 3 a.m. that morning, and so there was definitely something going on there. And my brother said he also smelt tobacco smoke of our granddad, her father, like a few weeks.
Well, that's the other thing I was going to say. In a lot of these cases, not only do they see the person, but the person says, "I've come to get you." That's very, very commonly reported too. So I mean, they've literally come to take you back over.
Yeah. Well, when I communicate with my mum through the spirit board or Ouija board, whatever you want to call it, maybe about a year after she passed, and she suddenly came through with a message, and there was other witnesses there. It was all doing it, and I was the last person to have a go on this. She suddenly came through with the word saying, "Hi, son," literally, "Hi, son," and I knew straight away, because my mum never called me son, but by saying the words "Hi, son," I knew that it could only be one person at that time,
right?
But being my mum, because my dad was still around with us at the time, you see. So, of course, when you're faced with talking to someone who's technically in the eyes of the world, they're technically dead and deceased, but here they are communicating with you quite clearly through this glass method of spelling out the words. It's like a texting from the spirit world. That's how I've described it to people. You're kind of a bit dumbfounded. You always think, well, what do I say? It's like you're struck for things to say. So I said, have you met Granny and Granddad Bob, which is her mother and father? It's the kind of family name that we gave them, Granny and Granddad Bob. And she says, yes, my mum came and met me. So literally at the point of her death, she said, yeah. And then I followed this up with another question and answer session about 18 months later, again through the spirit board. I thought, right, this time I'm prepared. I got a list of questions, almost scientific, that I want to ask my mum. And I said, when you said that you met Granny Bob, what happened? Did you go out of your body into a tunnel of light or anything like that? And she said, no, she was already waiting in the corner of the room for me. And the corner of the room, when I looked and worked out the logistics, was right where the doorway was. And it's typical that in my research, lots of spirits seem to be appearing in doorways. And it's almost like a portal kind of thing, which we'll talk about a little bit as we get into this discussion we're going to talk about. So basically, I sent you this book called People from the Other World. Is that right? Yeah. And it was a link, and you can get it from, I think it's a library, the National Library.
Archive.org.
Archive.
I got it from. There's some other ones, but it's on there.
Yeah. So for anyone that's interested in this book, archive.org is where we've been.
It's free. It's a free download.
Yeah. I mean, I did buy a copy of it off Amazon for like £5 or something.
You can get the original for $500 if you're so inclined.
Oh, right. Well, I downloaded this what I thought was a Kindle book, but it's actually done in the original print. And so when I zoomed in, I couldn't read the print at all because it's so small.
Oh, no. Yeah.
So I just gave up. And then I found it later at this archive.org, which is much, much better version, which you can zoom in on and see the text clearly. And it's full of illustrations. So for the benefit of those that don't know really what we're talking about this guy who initially was a skeptic of all things paranormal, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Who was this guy, Colonel Henry?
Apparently he did a lot of things, but he was a reporter. So he apparently wrote a letter to the New York Sun about this. And then the one of their competitors, the Graphic, I believe, there's another name, but anyway, it's the Graphic. And they wanted him to do a whole series as an investigative reporter, to go to this place, Chittenden, Vermont, and spend time there and report objectively on what he saw. And I think, as you say, he was still really a skeptic at that point. So he went in and he got to know the mediums, whom he found rather difficult to get to know because they were paranoid. They'd been mistreated so badly that they were kind of paranoid about everybody, and especially reporters. I think they'd been given a pretty bad time by reporters that would be cynical and so on. But he got there, gained their confidence, and he spent, I don't know how many weeks there.
I think it was 12 weeks.
It was a long time. Yeah, a long time. He stayed there. And there were always people coming and going. And apparently it was like you were just lucky to get there. People came from, miles and miles away and were turned away because they didn't have a, reservation or whatever. But anyway, he was fortunate. They liked him and he stayed. And he observed these nightly sessions. And there was different kinds of physical manifestations that were there, all the way from the basic thing like voices or something moving or lights, all the way to actual spirits physically manifesting in ways that there was no explanation for, and doing things like dancing and singing and manifesting shawls and like this one little girl, Mayflower, you would give her a theme and she would make up a poem on the spot. So we're talking very much responsive. You couldn't prepare for that because you just give them a theme like, winter clothes, and she would make a rhyme out of it, see? And then he weighed some of them. They would get up on the scale and they would come out in different weights, like 58 or 68 or whatever, for somebody that should have weighed 130. And measured them back to back against people and also against the scale and so on, So everything he could think of to test these spirits, he did. He also, of course, made sure that there was no way they could be like actors coming up from the basement, is one thing that he kept thinking of what could this be? What could this be? But there, he checked all the ceilings and the floor and the underneath the floor and the windows and everything. And there was no explanation.
Yeah, so these mediums who did it were actually a family of mediums, as I understand it, and they inherited. They're called the Eddy family, Eddy, and they apparently inherited it from their mother. Their mother had the gift, as they called it back.
She was Scottish, of Scottish background.
Yeah, Scottish descent, and they traced. Somehow they were connected back to the Salem witch trials. A relative of theirs was in the Salem witch trials, I read. And so they believed that maybe these powers they had...
Wasn't she rescued? It seems to me she was rescued.
Or she escaped or something. I'm not quite sure. Yeah. So that's how she ended up, obviously, carrying on her life, and the descendants, the Eddy family, became who they were. And there was there was actually quite a few brothers. I think there might have been quite a large family as they did.
It was 11 kids.
Yeah, so I thought it was about 10, but 11, as you say. But the ones that are kind of more well known for this kind of ability was Horatio, I believe.
Horatio and William.
William, and then they had a sister that also did it.
I think it's Miranda or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. One of the brothers died, I think, in the Civil War or something, or he got ill from the Civil War. Yeah. And the others, they had it to a lesser degree, but it seemed to be that as children, at least, the mother tried to hide the powers that the children were developing from the father, who was a staunch kind of, Christian or something.
He was abusive.
Yeah, and he was quite psychologically disturbed by reading about what he did to the poor kids. Yeah. And apparently they were going to trance and things, and he would try and shake them out of trances, and these are involuntary trances. This wasn't the kids saying, "Look, let's play spooks tonight." They were just going off into trance without any kind of say-so in it. And I think it's probably, in hindsight, maybe the spirits were kind of training them or preparing them for their later pathway, perhaps. And he would try to wake up. And even one of the parts I read, that he'd even put like a hot coal in Horatio or William's hand, I can't remember which one it was, a hot coal. And he still didn't wake up from this trance. And he still bore the scars of that hot coal for the rest of his life on the palm of his hand, which is an interesting point, actually. For later verification, when hands started to appear in above the curtain where these spirits would come out, sometimes hands would appear first of all before the full manifestations of these ectoplasmic spirits from this material called ectoplasm, which emanates from the mediums. One of the hands that appeared actually only had 4 fingers. It had a finger missing, which is an interesting point, because people saying, "Oh, it's one of the family brothers," but in fact, this hand had literally a finger missing. Which is well,
what the skeptic said is, he was just holding one back. I mean, skeptics always
they've got an answer for everything. Yeah. And these are the skeptics that actually never go to these things as well.
Well, the point that you made was talking about the skeptics and the people that even like they were scientists and they came and they wrote debunking articles about it. He said they only stayed for like one day. He's there for weeks, and they would only stay for one session, and whatever happened, they would explain it away and write a negative review, But this is a point that I wanted to bring up, is that this idea that these things have been debunked and that mediums have been caught cheating and so on, the debunkers are more fraudulent than the mediums. So there's an awful lot of fraudulent debunking that went on and that continues to go on. But what happens is that people will, if there's, a whole bunch of evidence that it's genuine, And then one guy comes up with an idea or a testimony that he says he's debunked it. People grab onto that. People who are skeptical and are afraid of all of this, they grab onto the one debunker. They never vet him or her. They never make sure that the person's honest or is telling the truth. That blows the whole thing for them just because one guy says. It's kind of like a rumor, like somebody says your friend is a thief. Are you going to just accept that?
Yeah.
Because one guy says that,
Yeah.
But that's what happens in this field.
Yeah. It's interesting because the young Eddy family were eventually, I think one of the interesting stories I found at the very beginning of the book was where it was a snowy winter's night one time, and they were all kids, and they heard a horse and carriage pull up outside the house, and they looked through the window and they could see this ghostly carriage with horses and a coachman, and the horses had plumes on their heads, a bit, very, very well-to-do kind of carriage, and there was this grandmother figure sitting in the coach, and they opened the door, and even the father, who was skeptical or thought it was the work of the devil, went out and kind of, he might have nodded to the lady or something, I don't know, but they all saw it, and then gradually this coach faded away. And I read later that when they developed their mediumship, a high spirit came through and said what they saw all that time ago was the work of a high spirit that managed to manifest that sighting, and apparently it was their Scottish great-grandmother or something.
It was an ancestor.
Yeah. And the boys actually, when their own grandmother passed away, the mother of their mother, rather than a great-grandmother, when she passed away, the boys and the family, the kids, would see this grandmother periodically at a spinning wheel, and she was kind of translucent. And eventually, as time went on, they'd see her. They used to be afraid of her at the beginning, but as time went on, they'd see her and she appeared more solid, and eventually got to a point where she could converse with them, and they actually became more used to her and actually sort of felt kind of comforted by her presence. I suppose, given the fact that their dad was very abusive to them, someone like a kindly grandmother, even if she's on the other side appearing and saying, I'll look after you boys, or whatever she was saying, was perhaps a lot better than having the abusive father they did have. Yeah. And the father, he couldn't stop the phenomena happening. Even though he was praying and reading the Bible and everything, he could not stop the phenomena happening. So in the end, he actually sold his boys, I believe, to traveling circus men.
Yeah, I sold them out. Yeah, and then and they were really abused by those showmen, also not doing very well, and so on. Yeah,
It's
sad.
This is how they became mistrustful of people, I understand.
And the other thing was that the other people acted like their father, also. Bound their hands and gagged them and did all kinds of horrible things to them, supposedly to ascertain that it was real, but it was really abusive.
Yeah.
So they ended up with scars in their wrists and, the whole.
Yeah. These are boys that are maybe 10 or 11 and 12 years later or something like that. Yeah. And eventually, as I understand it, their father passed away. And so they decided to come back home because they were no longer fearful of their father because he was no longer there. And so they came back home, and that's how they ended up in the Chittenden farmhouse. But originally, before they started doing their mediumship there, they were actually touring around the country. I think they toured around Europe as well, I understood.
Yeah.
So
like
the idea of
60s or something.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So the idea of them having sort of trapdoors in the farmhouse or secret locations and hidden things like that.
Well, I was reading in there that one of the things they did was they would go out into the woods with the group that was watching, right, the audience, and they would just arbitrarily pick 3 trees and wrap a blanket around it, and that would become their cabinet, and then the spirits would come out of that.
Yeah.
Well, where are they coming from? Where can they come from? It's the woods. There's no place for them to come from. So, I mean, that issue is already solved. If the reporting is accurate.
Yes.
That issue of, because the first thing you go to is, this is actors.
Yeah.
Coming into the window or coming up through the floor. And one of the things that I thought was, well, where are they keeping these people? Because we're talking 10, 15 different characters, might come up. Where are they being fed and housed, and where are they getting their costumes, and all that kind of stuff. The logistics is impossible, but out in the woods, there's nothing.
Yeah.
No way those people. So if the report is accurate that actually happened, it's a done deal. It's not actors. And all the other, elements, like the woman that should weigh 138 gets on the scale and she's 68. Then she changes to 58, or, I mean, it's done already. And this is the thing that infuriates me a lot of times, although I try to be kind of philosophical about it. Skeptics are not rational. They think they are because there's safety in numbers, but they're actually irrational. So when they here's the thing. If you're a real skeptic, a skeptic is someone that wants to have something proven so they don't get fooled. They want it to be proved to them. But once it's proved to them, to pretend to remain skeptical, even though it's proved to you, is not rational. So, they have to realize they're not being rational.
Yeah.
The rational person is somebody like Olcott, who goes in and tests it and weighs them and, does everything he can think of to make sure that they can't get in through the doors or the walls or anything. And he says, it tests out.
Yeah. Well, in fact, I understand his history was that he was in the military for a while, hence the title colonel, and he was promoted to colonel because he actually was almost like a detective.
He was an investigator.
Yeah.
So he had the training.
Yeah. And then he was later called to be like one of the 3 people to investigate the, or write up on it or something to do with the Lincoln assassination as well.
Was he? Okay.
He was connected to that. So he was a highly kind of respected guy, I suppose. But
it makes me think of Robert Snow, a fellow here who was the head of homicide investigation for the city of Indianapolis. Against his wishes, ended up finally having a past life regression. And it had a profound experience and tried to disprove it. Using his professional detective techniques, he tried his best to disprove it, and he ended up proving it. So he wrote a book and admitted he proved it because that was his training, And
then it all went badly wrong for him or something. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I think he lost his job and everything from it. He's still an author, so he's, just kind of changed jobs. But this happens quite a bit. If you dare to come out, you lose your job.
Yeah. It's a shame, isn't it? Just for your beliefs. You can profess to be a Christian and say, being a Christian, I accept a man walked on water. He rose from the dead after 3 days and then ascended into heaven, did all these miraculous miracles. That seems to be quite acceptable to believe in. And, someone says you're a Christian, that's fine, keep your job. But then you start to talk about something like reincarnation, or I believe in spirits that manifest in a seance room. Then people will think you're crackers.
Well, this is the point. Olcott makes this point, and this is the point that I made in my past life when I studied this, and a lot of the spiritualists did, and that is that the churches were up against secularism, materialism. They were up against, atheism, and they're losing, like they've lost now, and the spiritualists were saying, your only real chance is to join with us, and recognize that the things that you believe happened in the past are happening now, and we're measuring them and we're, observing them and so on. And they refused to do it. They snubbed the spiritualists and wouldn't have anything to do with them. And as a result, they lost out completely.
Yeah.
Lost their ability, whereas they had their opportunity.
Interestingly, though, there are, and I've been to one of them a couple of times many years ago, Christian spiritualist churches, which I always found quite odd, because I think, well, how do they sort of blend that with the Bible and thou shalt not consult soothsayers and all that kind of stuff it says in the Bible, and yet they're talking to the dead, so to speak, in Christian spiritualist churches. And it's something I'd really like to find out.
But there is no such thing as the Bible. That's the problem. The Bible is an arbitrarily put together compilation of different sources and different stories.
Yeah.
And some of it I think is inspired and some of it isn't. And some of it's been taken out of context and some of it's been distorted. And you really have to use some discernment and pick and choose if you get into that book. Yeah. Because if you get into Deuteronomy, it says it's okay to stone a woman to death, but only under certain circumstances. You know what I'm saying? When I read that, I thought, man, you can't take this book as a whole.
No.
You got to pick and choose,
Yeah. It's made up of different editions from different parts of the...
different people, different prophets, different sources. Yeah.
Different times. Yeah, exactly. So, stones. The Henry, I think his first time of seeing the Eddy brothers was at these stones that they called, what was it? Honcho's Cave or something? Two rocks had fallen together.
Right, they've made kind of a cave because they're
cave, yeah. So it's not a true cave that's in a mountain. It's these huge rocks, literally like the size of houses that are
Honto.
That's it. Honto's cave. They fell together, and the back of where these two rocks touch is almost like a small cave. And again, similar to the idea of being in the woods, he was taken there, I think, on his first night there, and I think they must have erected a curtain. I'm not quite sure of that now, the details of that, but it was kind of getting dark or something, and suddenly they saw this Native American Indian standing on the rocks above them, who was like 6 foot or something. And then someone else pointed to this smaller woman who was this Native American lady who later became known as Honto, and she was only sort of like 5 foot something or something. And they were regular visitors to the circle from the spirit world, so it said. And that's where he first witnessed it. And he thought, well, were these people waiting around the backs of the rocks or something, maybe?
Well, they tested that. Yeah. Some of the kids went out the next day and looked where they should have seen footprints. It was snow, and they should have seen footprints, and there was no footprints.
Right.
In other words, they had manifested bang right where they were. They hadn't traveled there, you know.
Mm. So eventually, after they did their traveling around Europe, they settled back into the Eddy farmstead, and by day they were like being farmers or something like that, weren't they? Doing sort of their daily tasks.
It's the usual thing, yeah.
Yeah, but they decided to kind of do it. It was almost like a bed and breakfast type of setup as well, from what I understood, is that the word started to get round about their mediumship, and they would do it every single night apart from a Sunday. And even then, they weren't charging a lot of money, I understood. It was something just to cover the food and their bed for the night or something.
It wasn't too much. It was a little bit, but it's hard to judge because, you know, the inflation, you know, it was so much money. They might charge $1. I don't know what it was, or 25 cents or something. It wasn't too much, I don't think.
Yeah, so they had various people stay where they could, but as you say, these people weren't very welcoming of people simply because they distrusted people. But in a weird way, they welcomed these people to their house to witness this phenomenon, but they distrusted them all the same. And you're thinking, if these were definite frauds, and they weren't really making that much money. They were doing it every single night. They're inviting strangers into their home, upsetting their home life on a regular basis. All for what? You know, they were living very simple lives, really, and they were very simple folk by all accounts. They weren't that greatly intelligent. One of them might have learnt to write, but basically they didn't have much schooling either, did they?
I don't think the book didn't go into their motivation too much. So I don't know if they felt that they had a calling and that was their mission, or whether they just were trying to support the family, or, you know, I really don't know. I didn't get that out of the book. But what I do see is that if you're running kind of a business out of your home, then you have to separate out your life from the guests. I mean, that would be true if you're running a hotel or everything else.
Yeah.
So Olcott apparently got to know them well enough that he would sit around the fire and smoke the pipe with the family. So he kind of got accepted into the family eventually, more or less. But I mean, if you're running a hotel or something, you can't let all the guests into your personal life.
Yeah.
You know, it's not really being unsociable. It's just normal that you have to keep your family life a little bit apart, I would think.
And the more Olcott was there, the more people started to flood to that area, because he was sending off these weekly letters to the newspapers that were then publishing them on a weekly basis, his latest kind of diary of what's been happening. And of course the word was getting around New York and wherever, and they were flocking to this area, and eventually started to spill out into neighboring hotels and places just so they could come there. And so it was pretty much a full house every night. And I think one of the first people to manifest in the home under the regular kind of mediumship seances they used to do was a sailor or something who declared,
Dix, I think is it?
Yeah,
Dix.
and he said that this room it will be used solely for the mediumship demonstrations, apart from the occasional quiet dance, which I thought was kind of funny.
That is funny.
So this room was basically, I mean, there are plans that were drawn up by Olcott's artist who went there with him, who drew portraits of the Eddy family. He drew the house. He drew the whole kind of diagram of how it was all set out. and he even drew the seances, presumably as they were occurring, or kind of must have done rough sketches and then drew them up better later on. Because he couldn't really take photographs, I presume, in the seance because of the conditions that required.
It was very dark. You could barely, most of the time, I think, as he describes it, you could barely recognize features. If you're really close, you could, you know.
Yeah.
So that he's clear, you know, he's honest about that it was very dark. There was like
so this
one
is where the
little light
skeptics
somewhere.
would come through and say, well,
Sure.
how can you say it's definitely such and such? There's one incident I read, and I can't remember, but I think it was a young girl whose father came through. Now, this was an interesting point. Her father came through and greeted her, and she recognized him. But she knew her father was in the Navy or something. So she sent out a mental telepathic request to him. She didn't voice it openly to anybody. She just said mentally, like, where's your naval uniform? Why haven't you come in your naval uniform? So he literally walked off the stage, as it were, behind the curtain. 2 minutes later, this spirit reappeared in a full Navy uniform.
Yeah.
Because he acquiesced to her request of coming back in a Navy uniform.
Oh, well, there's so many stories. I can't even remember them all. I just read about maybe 2/3 of the book myself. But I can't remember all the examples, you know, but the upshot of it is that if it's accurately reported, there's just no question,
Yeah.
you know, that it is what it was purported to be, you know. Only there are two explanations that come to mind. One is as actors, people coming up, but that's impossible, you know, because there's nowhere for them to have come from, you know, because he checked. And the other thing is that he's made the whole thing up out of whole cloth. And I think that's extremely unlikely, especially since you've got other people, you know, witnessing and so on. So,
well, that's right. There was plenty of people going there. And
there's people that wrote affidavits and notarized them and everything. And unless he made all that up also, you know, I think it's extremely unlikely.
Yeah.
So basically, yeah.
And the word came back down through the Eddy family as their descendants. You know, the word, our you know, great whatever's used to do this stuff, you know, and they remembered it in the family. It was, I think it was one of the younger sisters ended up having children who later became the descendants of the Eddy family. So I think they died in like 1902 or something like that. There are graves out there that people have found of them, just like any other grave. There's nothing sort of remarkable about each gravestone and things. It doesn't say famous spiritualist or medium or anything like that, as far as I'm aware anyway. But it was one of these things that what bowled me over, it wasn't like just once in a blue moon they'd do these seances. It was every single night. And the amount of energy that must have required to sustain that kind of level of mediumship, because the thing about physical mediumship is a very, very different thing from mental mediumship. Now, we're mostly familiar, you know, a lot of the listeners, viewers might be familiar with mental mediumship. That is the people that will go on stage like Tony Stockwell, the American guy, I forget his name.
Well, there's a bunch of them, but Matt Glazer is the one I've been following.
Yeah, so, but they're on stage and they're doing what they call typically clairvoyance, where they're picking up mental images or words or impressions telepathically somehow, and they're relaying that to the audience. And that's as kind of far as it goes with those. Still impressive if they get it all right, you know, of course. But these people, the Eddy brothers and other physical mediums, are going up quite a few notches where they're actually sitting almost, as you say, in darkness. Later mediumship would develop where they would have like an infrared light, which was a safer way of seeing what was happening in a brighter light. That was the sort of techniques employed by William Crookes, who was testing out the mediumship as Florence Cook, I think it was, who brought through the spirit of Katie King. And he was testing her for 3 years in his own laboratory at home, you know, so he had control of the conditions as such. And this 15-year-old girl, you know, as when she started doing her demonstrations to him, you know, she would just go there and he'd say, right, can you go into a trance? She would fall into a trance and outstep behind this curtain a completely different person called Katie King. And he compared them. One had ear piercings in their ear. I think it was the medium had ear piercings, where Katie King, the spirit, didn't have ear piercings. And one had sort of slightly curly hair and the other one didn't. It was just completely two different people. And yet they were saying, oh, it's the medium dressing up as the spirit. And yet William Crookes said on quite a few occasions, Katie King would pull back the curtain and you could see the medium fast asleep inside the cabinet or behind the curtain fast asleep, showing that there's actually two different people.
So here's the thing. What, at that point, that explanation is done. I mean, I can't think of any other explanation. It's two people. It's done. So, and an honest skeptic would drop that one, but they don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that one's already been disproved, so we can put that on the shelf, but this is what I did when I first started looking into mental mediumship. John Edward was the fellow.
John Edward, that was the guy.
Crossing over.
Yeah.
Goes back a few years. I don't know, we're talking like 2005 or something like that. So anyway, I got hold of a whole bunch of VHS copies of his show, and I watched them, and I had a list of possible explanations, normal explanations, which are plants in the audience and guessing and editing, to just do the ones where he, and and cold reading and leading questions. And as I watched him, when I saw one of those explanations disproved, I checked it off. It's done. He's disproved that one. And I checked the next one off, and I checked the next one off. Finally, I said, the last two, which are plants in the audience and editing, I'm not going to be able to check off unless I see him in person. So I went and saw him in person, and he was able to do the same thing. And so I said, it's definitely not editing because he's doing it here. And then the last one was plants in the audience. So what he did is he says there's somebody that's, there's blackness in the chest, and he gave a couple names, and he can't find anybody that'll own that. So he goes right to an area, and he points, says it's right here. And he's standing right next to me, facing the other way. And these people are like 15 feet away. And there's two ladies. And he says, I think it's you, And she says, well, it was in the chest and it went to the brain or something like that. In other words, it was right, but it was just a little variation. And he says, okay. And he starts talking about how one of them couldn't get there, couldn't say goodbye. And she'd been in California, and she broke down crying that she wasn't able to say goodbye. And, but the names were matching. Everything was matching, right? So, okay. So, I mean, he did a lot of that. So another 15 minutes go by, and the show is over, and it's like 3,000 people. So we all get up, and we have to wait a little while to file out, And I looked over at this lady. Nobody's looking at her. Nobody's paying any attention to her at all, and she's still crying. And I thought, that's one heck of an actress, if that's an actress, to keep it up.
Yeah.
Nobody's paying any attention 15 minutes later, And I said, that eliminates plants. That's the last thing. I checked it off.
Yeah.
So since I was able to check off every single normal explanation with this guy, I say he's genuine.
Well, I kind of, I do agree with that because, I do a little bit of mediumship. I mean, I would not put myself in the level of John Edwards or any of these other well-known TV mediums. They are leagues above me, but I've studied in psychic circles. I actually disbelieved that I had any ability whatsoever because I never claimed to have seen ghosts or anything. But an opportunity came up when I was about 22, 23, because I was visiting the spiritualist church. They said, look, they're going to start a developing circle. Anybody that's interested, come and join us, make yourself known. So I thought, I'm curious enough to give this a go because I've been told by various mediums at various things, oh, you're psychic. And I kept thinking, really? I can't be, So I was accepted into this circle. And one of the things we had to do was learn to kind of meditate, which I'm not really that good at, to be honest. And we had to tune in to the various people opposite us. And one of the things that started to really kind of quaked me in my boots a little bit was the fact that I had to tune into this guy opposite. And as I went into this kind of almost like a slumber, I heard this voice, dreamlike voice in my head in a Cockney accent. Now, I know that people maybe in America don't understand Cockney and London and things like that. So basically, on the far east of London, in what you might call the Bronx of New York, where you have a real draw, they would have a, all right, mate, kind of London accent,
Yes.
Well, a voice came through into my head like that in a Cockney accent, what I would describe as sounded like a London cabbie driver. And the voice clearly said, because I was focusing on the old guy ahead of me, it clearly said, and it was a full sentence, tell him he's got something wrong with his waterworks. And I went, oh, crikey, where did that come from? And it brought me out of this kind of semi-slumber. Yeah. And I thought, the hell was that about? I never say the word waterworks. It's just not my phrase.
Right.
So I remember reading how mediums would wrap up messages for privacy. They'd kind of do it in the saying, I'm saying this to you and you'll understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Nobody else will. I thought, right, well, this could be embarrassing for this poor guy, in front of all these ladies, that I'm going to say something private about his medical thing.
Right.
So the best I could do at the time, and obviously I would do it a lot better now, I suppose, I hope anyway, I said, I understand you're seeing a doctor about a medical complaint. And that's all I could say because I really didn't know what else to say. And he goes, oh, yes, you're right. Now, that could be very, very general. But I could have, if I thought about it, saying, look, I've got a guy who's got a Cockney voice here. He's talking about bladder problems, blah, blah, blah. But I didn't. And that's just because I was inexperienced at it. And then when I spoke to a friend of mine on the phone late that week, who was like, at the time, 10 years older than me, he kind of knew, he was more worldly than I. And he said, that's probably because he had prostate problems. And I said, what's a prostate? I didn't even know what it was. Young guys don't. It's only when you get older you find out these things. Right. And he said, well, that can cause, bladder problems. It can enlarge and cause bladder problems and make you want to go to the loo all the time. Literally the waterworks, tell him he's got something wrong with his waterworks. And so I thought, crikey, maybe that was accurate. Now, I have sat in circles since, done developing, and I've not been like a touring medium or anything. Occasionally, I've done what they call open platform, where people are invited to get up in front of the audience and try and do some mediumship. And I've had some quite interesting experiences. And around the Christmas time, just got back in December, I was at the spiritualist place here in Weymouth in Dorset, and they'd booked me in to do this thing. And first of all, I'll just say, I'm not doing it for the money, because how much of a huge sum of money did I earn at the end? I earned myself £10. £10 for my trouble, So people say they're in it for the money. Rubbish, £10.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Because you're getting up there without a script. You don't know what you're going to say or what you're going to do or how well you're going to do. And you've got to do it maybe for an hour and a half or something. So I get up there. Now, the very last person, I was doing all right. I wasn't doing brilliantly, but I felt I was doing all right. It was a bit like pulling teeth. But they said, you got time for one more person. So I said, okay. And I said, I feel drawn to the back of the room over there, which I did do. And I said, and suddenly the word Pete popped into my head.
Yeah, no, this is the one you sent me. Yeah.
Yeah, I said, I want to say the name Pete or Peter. And this lady says, I can take Pete. And I said, okay. I said, I feel that, and I said, I don't feel he's a husband, but I feel he's a brother. Is that correct? And she goes, yeah. And I thought, oh my God, 2 out of 2. I'm doing well here. And then I started saying, I want to talk about painting and decorating for some reason. I don't know why. Painting and decorating as a profession. I said, did he do that? And she goes, no, he didn't do that. I said, I don't know why. And then I felt drawn to talk about his boys or boy. I said, did he have a boy that works in the painting and decorating profession? She goes, oh, yeah, he did, or does. Well, yeah, because he's obviously passed on. And I said, I think I want to talk about him. And then suddenly I got this thing through. Now, I remember talking to a medium last summer, and she says to her class, if you get something through, no matter how ridiculous it seems, she goes, say it and sod it. Is the word she used. So I thought, okay, I've got to say it. I says, I feel that I'm being told that this young son is involved in stolen cars.
Yeah, and that's going out on a limb.
Yeah, and she said, yes, you're absolutely right.
What are the chances of that?
Yeah. And I said, I feel that with the painting and decorating, literally, to use that metaphor, he's painting himself into a corner. And I think they're saying that you might better help paint himself out.
So you've got two juxtaposing hits there.
Yeah. And then, as I was talking about this, I started to see a ferry boat. Now, I know I've probably told you this as well, but I'll say it for the benefit of the audience. I started to see a ferry boat. And I said, I don't know why I'm seeing a ferry boat with you. And I said, I can see 3 destinations connected with it. Oh, prior to that, I suddenly said, and it just started to flow with it, I said, I can see Norway with you.
That's the other one. Yeah.
And she said, are you connected with Norway? And she goes, yes, I am. And I said, yep, I can see you've got a connection with Norway. And I think that, you might go there as well. But anyway, I started talking about this ferry boat, and I said, I can see 3 points on a map, like from here to here to here. I said, it's like a triangle. And then suddenly it hit me. I said, there's actually a TV show with about this very subject of a ferry boat that would visit 3 points. And it was like something about this ferry boat. And I said, and I said, it had the actress Kate O'Mara in it. And I just suddenly blurted it out. And she said, well, actually, I used to know Kate O'Mara, the actress, the TV actress.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
Yeah. And I thought, crikey.
You're hitting on like 5 points here.
Yeah. And I'm thinking.
So that's beyond chance.
Now, I wasn't saying that I was in communication with the late actress Kate O'Mara, who died in 2012, but I'm thinking, I've just said something that she's connected to, and I thought I said the name randomly, like the show with Kate O'Mara. But then I started to think about it afterwards. I'm thinking, okay, I don't really know much about Kate O'Mara's acting stuff, whatever she's done. The only series that I could remember her from was this TV show, the 80s, where it was called Triangle because they visited 3 points, like Dover in on the south of England, somewhere in Calais in France, and maybe somewhere else, as a third point.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, what are the chances somebody's connected to Norway? Yeah. What are the chances that somebody does painting and decorating? What are the chances that they steal cars? And what are the chances that they know that they personally knew this particular actress? They're astronomical. And you put it all together, I mean, they're absolutely astronomical. So apparently you were working with somebody on the other side was, I think that when people do mediumship, correct me if I'm wrong, they generally work with people on the other side that are bringing the information through. It's not just like necessarily direct, but they've got an intermediary or several intermediaries.
Yeah, I think that's usually. Yes, yeah, that's it. Because
so I would say you've got somebody at that point. Somebody's working with you.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because these people that are coming back, they necessarily have not got the skills to do it themselves, and so they might be passing on the information to presumably a spirit guide, like you say, a team.
Well, they all the mental mediums say they're telling me this. They're showing me this. Well, who's the they? It's the people. Their team. Yeah.
So whether I do have a spirit guide that was working through me that evening, I never felt a spirit guide. I never got any names of any spirit guides or anything like that. I was just receiving either the thought, like the name. Now, for me to get a name Pete, I would see an image of someone, and I'd see like a famous person, and I'd say, I can see, say, for example, I might see an image of Ronald Reagan in my mind. So I say, can anyone take the name Ronald or Ronnie or something like that, But when I got the name Pete, I didn't see anyone called Pete. It was just literally the name dropped into my voice to say the word Pete. I don't know how that worked. So, but I seem to be getting quite good at names for some reason. And I remember when I first started getting hits with names, I was talking to my daughter on the phone and I was saying, I'm getting quite good at names. I was telling her my progression in this field and stuff. And she goes, okay then, Dad. She goes, because she just got a new boyfriend at the time. She said, what is the name of Chris, her new boyfriend? What is the name of his mum? And she says, I'll give you a clue. It starts with M. And I said, you shouldn't have said that. You shouldn't have given me a clue. I just suddenly said Mary. And she goes, oh my God, how did you know that? I said, well, you said the letter M. So I just said Mary. And she goes, well, okay. What's the name of his dad then? I said, well, don't tell me anything. And then instantly I saw in my mind an image of my own father, and my own father was called Brian. So I just said, Brian? And she goes, oh my God, that's his name, Brian. So again, that's how it worked for me. I saw the name of my dad, who happened to have the same name as her boyfriend's father, you see?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's interesting how that works. Now, getting back to the mediumship of the Victorian Eddy brothers, as I say, they were leagues above most mediums today, and it's such a rare thing, this physical mediumship. I mean, I first heard about these guys when I was reading the book of a Scottish medium who was talking about his experiences in physical mediumship, and he happened to mention in passing about these Eddy brothers, and that's what this trial to investigate these people who were doing this brilliant mediumship out in the States. But interestingly, this guy who wrote this book, Alexander, I can't remember his whole name now. He interviewed various people who were witness to a medium in the north of England, in Durham, I think his name was. And what was his name now? Gosh, something like a very unusual name. But this medium was a very kind of calm, down to earth guy. He wasn't boastful or anything like that. Full Selkirk, Hunter Selkirk, I think his name was. That's the name that comes. No, he's not very well known. Yeah. He died in 1965, and his name's long lost to history. I mean, there's one newspaper cutting I found of him, Hunter Selkirk. Yeah, I think it was Hunter Selkirk, and he was not only a brilliant medium, but he was also brilliant at physical mediumship. And one time he was there, according to the book I read anyway, he was there with some guys, and he just said spontaneously, "Hey, let's try some table tilting, shall we?" Which is where the table rocks about. The idea is the spirits will rock the table about. So they moved this table into the center of the room, and literally, as soon as they just moved into the center of the room, Hunter Selkirk, just without warning, he just fell into a trance like that and almost fell asleep standing up. And the two guys that had helped him move the table into the center of the room sort of stood there thinking, what's happening? What's happening? And then they suddenly saw, and I presume this was in a semi-darkened room, but I don't know for sure. It wasn't said. But they saw this, what they thought was ectoplasm, coming out of both of his nostrils. And it came down into two strands, down onto the table, and they started to form into foot-high figures, just a foot high, pure white. And they formed into an Elizabethan man and an Elizabethan woman in full Elizabethan dress, including the frills, the lace, the cufflinks, the buckles on their shoes, and everything. It was like miniature dolls, but they were fully animated human beings, but about a foot high. And they turned and bowed to each other, and then they turned to the men who were the witnesses, and they bowed to them like that. And these two guys, they're both so gobsmacked, they couldn't say anything. They just sort of stood and stared like jaw dropping, And then they bowed again, and then they turned, and they just dissipated back down, and then the ectoplasm went back up into his nose. And then Hunter Selkirk woke up from this trance, and he says, "What's happened? Have I missed anything?"
Yeah,
and it actually happened straight away like that. And
fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that was an amazing story. So when you get these mediums that produce this phenomenon, it's not always like 6 foot high Native American Indians. These were Elizabethan characters, only a foot high. Now,
and it's hard to find actors that size.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's not much call for it these days. Yeah. It's a shame that it was only witnessed by two guys, if it's done.
I'd love to see something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm still hoping and holding out. I mean, there's places I'm looking at. There's potential places I'd like to visit. I think there's one in Portsmouth I'd like to visit. I might try and contact the lady again and see if I can maybe find out if they're doing anything. It tends to be when mediums are visiting them rather than them doing weekly sessions. And the thing about this phenomenon is that you normally, if you're a physical medium, you have to sit for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, sometimes years, trying to develop this sort of stuff. And everybody has to be totally dedicated to it to be regular attendees. So when the Eddy brothers were doing their 90 sessions, they just had it from the word go. It was so natural to them. It was like someone was born with a natural singing ability or something, like Shirley Temple. This mediumship was so natural to them that it could not be stopped. Hence, they were going into trances as children and freaking their dad out, basically. But it was not only like members of the audience, it was relatives sort of coming through. When people would come from abroad, like Madame Blavatsky of the Theosophical Society, this is obviously how this became a development. The Theosophical Society actually happened, I believe, through Henry Occult's visits to the Eddy homestead, because that's where he met her, and then they kind of got together later and formed the Theosophical Society. But when she came, and she came from like Russia or somewhere like that, they were like bringing out like Russian soldiers, or I think one of them was described as a former family bodyguard who'd come out or something, and he presented medals that belonged to her father or something like that as well.
I think he was buried with him, wasn't he?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So I mean, again, if the Eddy brothers were getting employed actors, they certainly had to really go to town.
There's no way. That would definitely preclude actors. So basically, I mean, if you're skeptical, you have to see it yourself. I think. I mean, if you want to eliminate everything, you have to actually see it in front of you, and then I guess it's up to you how honest you want to be with yourself, at that point.
Yeah. Now, the skeptics of today will say, well, look, if this phenomenon is real, why aren't we seeing it on TV? Why aren't we seeing videos on YouTube of, manifestations and full spirits walking around the room? Which is a pretty good question, And one of the books I read with this medium, Alexander, whatever his name is, the Scottish medium, he actually fell out with other mediums because they said, look, we can now film you in infrared in your seance room and film these materializations. But he absolutely point blank refused. He said, he thought long and hard about it. And he actually wrote in his book, I just decided not to do it because he didn't want to be, he didn't want to come too much under the spotlight or something. I don't think he wanted his name out there too much. I think.
Well, you see what happened to the kids, the Eddy kids.
Yeah.
And what you find is that people who are absolutely dead set against it, they will do anything they possibly can, including being irrational, including phony debunking, to discredit it. But if they absolutely can't, they'll get violent. They won't. In other words, they're never going to give you the satisfaction of saying, you're right. I agree. I was wrong and you're right. They'll never do that. They'll eventually get violent. So, you don't want that.
No, I think this is it. The guy wanted his privacy. He wanted a kind of life. He was prepared to give some of it to the public, but only the public that were kind of sympathetic to the cause as such, and
honest. And the ones that are honest, see, because these debunkers are not honest.
Yeah. Well,
why should you deal with somebody like that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's, it'd just be an extra headache for him, really. If it was one of those things that if I was the medium and I was going to be producing psychic phenomena, I would probably say, well, I'm going to film myself, but I'm just not going to tell anybody about it or put it out there. And if there's manifestations that occur, again, I'd film it myself, but then I'd maybe put it in a will or something that after I'm dead, these tapes can then be accessed or something.
There's another side to this, and that is that I gather that on the other side, they have certain rules and regulations as to what spirits are permitted to do to interfere with physical world.
Oh, really?
And that's what I understand. And there's references to it here and there. You can find that. But certain people have a license, basically, and some people don't.
Right.
And unless you're going to be a renegade, you basically have to go along with the program and what the elders have decided. And not everybody is given the go-ahead to do that, So I think that's another element to it.
Yeah, but it's interesting, actually, you saying that about permissions being given from the other side, because what was it my mum said when she came through the board? I can't remember the specifics of it, but she said something like, I was asking her, I said, are you here in the room with us? And she said, yes, or something. And will I ever see you or something like that? I can't remember, but she said something like, she goes, no, you won't ever see me unless it's extremely important that I have to.
There you go. Yeah.
Be visible. Or
exactly. Yeah.
That, I'm paraphrasing her words here. I can't remember exactly how she put it now, but basically, unless it's like an emergency, that she has to appear to me,
right?
Which would require presumably a lot more energy, I guess, or something, special conditions or something that she would not normally typically be seen. And she said something like, we're not meant to be seen or something like that. Certainly everyday things. I think maybe in certain things certain conditions, you can see them under those controlled conditions, like the Eddy brothers. But I don't think the idea is that everyone's just walking down the road and their spirits materializing with everybody.
No, I don't think it would actually be helpful.
Yeah. The world wouldn't get along, really, because if like you've assassinated, for instance, JFK, and then JFK materializes walking down the road and he says, well, actually, the whole conspiracy behind my death is this, and this, the CIA or the FBI or so are not going to be too pleased about it.
They're going to have trouble assassinating him again.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Keep your mouth shut. Otherwise, we're going to keep you alive.
There's another element that I've run across, and that is that all of these things take a tremendous amount of energy.
Yeah.
And I think that there's only a certain amount of energy that's permitted to be expended or that's available. so that's kind of released for expression. So there's an awful lot of people that need a contact, and they need it more than you do. And this is a question in mental mediumship where there's a demonstration in an audience. The people that get read typically are the ones that desperately need it.
Yeah.
If I went there and I already know there's life after death and I don't have a burning need for it, I'm probably not going to get read. It's the person that desperately needs to hear from their father or their child or whatever it is. So there's kind of a need to not just need to know, but where is this energy going to be spent? And it has to be spent where it's really needed.
Yeah. So when I was going to get to is the fact that with your previous life as Matthew, he would have gone to demonstrations of mediumship. He was interested in this kind of stuff anyway, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was a member of the Portland, Maine Spiritualist Association. He was an officer. And there's a couple things that he did with them. One of them was there was a minister who was a very kind of hard-boiled fellow who was against mediumship and against spiritualism. And so he gave a sermon against it. So this group got together and their president gave a talk in response. So then there was a book printed that was, well, first off, Matthew reported on all of these things because he was an anonymous reporter in there in Portland. And then a book came out of the speech. But it was not really the speech, because when Matthew reported on the speech, he said it was very disorganized. But the booklet, and I've got it here, this is called A Reply to William T. Dwight, D.D., on Spiritualism. And this is it here. So Matthew, I ghost wrote this whole thing in my past life. I'm sure of it by style and everything else. He ghost wrote it for him. So that was one of the things he did. But then in 1855, he's on record as doing scientific investigation. When I say scientific, I mean they did the same thing that Olcott did. But this is 1855, so like 20 years earlier. And this was in Boston. Apparently there was a young girl that was acting as the medium. And what they did is they went for several sessions, and what they saw was the kind of stuff that the Eddys were doing early on. Musical instruments floating around, playing by themselves, hands, and lights, appearing and things like that. So these members of the club got together, and I think Matthew wrote the article, but they reported exactly what they saw and they signed it. So we've got my past life signature along with this small group saying I saw this and I saw this and I saw this and I saw this, and we checked everything carefully to make sure that it couldn't be by any normal. In other words, they did the same kind of investigation that Olcott was doing. So I actually did that. I don't have any memory of it, but I have physical proof. I've got it here. I've got that here too. So, I've got the actual proof of it.
Now, you thought that maybe Matthew might have visited the Eddy farmstead along.
There's one little piece in the book where it says, and he's... back then, if somebody didn't want to be identified, you'd put a line or you would just mention them briefly, but you wouldn't identify really who they were. So he says a Mr. Whittier came and was visited by his daughter, who said something like, Daddy dear, or whatever it was, Well, Matthew had lost a little girl at like 8 months.
Wow.
Not old enough to be speaking like that. But there's not that many Mr. Whittiers who would be willing to go to one of these sessions, And we know Matthew Franklin Whittier, we know he had that history. So was it a coincidence that some other Whittier ended up at the, at the Eddys? We don't know.
It certainly seemed logical to assume that if it was being written up in the newspapers of the day, that Matthew would perhaps read about it at some point, being that the fact it must have been the talk of the spiritualists on the East Coast and stuff.
Well, he would have definitely been aware of it, no question.
Yeah. So the next logical step is that he would have perhaps been interested enough to go like other people.
I have some evidence suggesting that he was personal friends with Daniel Douglas Hume.
Right, who was the
Scottish physical medium. Because there's no mention of it in Matthew's correspondence, but Matthew's brother, John Greenleaf Whittier, corresponded with Hume. I've got a couple, 3 letters, and there's no reason for them to correspond because John Greenleaf Whittier was really pretty cynical about mediumship. There's no reason why they would be friends.
Yeah.
Unless what happened, because this was right about the time Matthew died, 1883.
Right.
So whom would have written his brother condolences?
Yes.
That's how they would have got connected, and then whom would have written back, and there would have been 2 or 3 letters back.
Right, yes.
See?
Yes.
So it's kind of, I can kind of infer that Matthew must have been friends with whom. So if he was friends with Daniel Douglas, I'm going to say it right, then almost for sure he would have been aware of the Eddys, and almost for sure he would have gone at some point.
Yes. Yeah, this is what I think. That they were too well known. The fact that word was getting out and everyone was traveling from far afield, it would suggest that he would not have wanted to miss that opportunity, I would have thought, if they said, look, let's all go down there, some, friends, and they all traveled down there and stayed there. And it kind of ties up a little bit with your research, that the little girl came out.
Well, here's my question. And there is, I understand that people on the other side grow up on the other side. That's what I've been told.
Yeah.
But this had been like he lost that little girl in 1841. This is 1875, 74.
Yeah.
So, but what I noticed about this book is that the old ladies are coming through as old ladies, and the babies are coming through as babies, and everybody's coming through as they were when they died, seemingly, in this story. But I don't know. I mean, my guess is that they might do that if you will feel more comfortable with that. In other words, if your mother died at 85 and she comes through the way she is on the other side at like 30, you're not going to recognize her. It's not going to be authentic to you,
Yeah.
So I guess they come through at the age that you feel comfortable.
Yes, that's identifiable.
Yeah. So that means that that Matthew's little girl who died in 1841 could have come through at any age, basically.
Yes. Yeah. And she
so
came through at an age where it's just past her age of death, maybe, but enough to speak.
Enough
say
to speak.
something.
Yeah. I mean, that's a theory. It's a theory. I can't prove it, because there were other Whittiers, and, but it's a lot of the research I've done is tantalizing like that. It's almost clinched, but not quite. There's a little wiggle room. There's some other explanations. That's pretty normal, when you research these things. Very rarely do you get something like the Eddys where it's just, it's overwhelming. It's utterly overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah.
What they could do.
Disturbingly overwhelming. That's the
that's what Olcott says, that it drove them nuts, The skeptics, they didn't know what to do with it.
Did any of Olcott's relatives or friends come through for personal messages for him?
I don't remember that.
I can't recall reading that myself, but it just made me wonder, maybe. Anyway, what I think we'll do here, we'll take a little break here on the Paranormal Peep Show.
Good for the waterworks.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're talking here to Stephen Sakellarios. We're talking about the Eddy Farmstead, the mediums that were around in the 1870s doing amazing mediumship, basically, in Vermont. And we're also talking other mediums and physical mediumship. So stay tuned for part 2 of the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK radio network.
Today's the best day of my life. Woohoo! Listening to the Paranormal UK radio network.
Join Andy and Neil every month on the Paranormal Peep Show, part of the Paranormal UK radio network, for fun, frolics and lots of information about weird stuff, UFOs, ghosts and things that go bump in the night and everything associated with them. Fascinating guests, fascinating talk, fascinating information.
Hi, welcome back to the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK radio network. This is Neil Gedeswold and I'm talking with Stephen Sakellarios, and we're discussing all things physical mediumship and spooky in itself. We've been talking about the Eddy family, who are from Vermont in the United States, and they were around in the 1870s at the height of their fame, where they were doing full-bodied materializations of spirits under the investigation of Colonel Olcott, I believe his name. Is that how we say it? That's right.
Correct.
Who was also kind of well known because he investigated and did the research on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, I understand. So he kind of led the investigations on that. And it was because of his detective skills and his investigative abilities that he was charged by a newspaper to go down and spend at least 12 weeks with this family, these simple farmers, producing these miraculous and amazing manifestations. So you got some reports there, I understand, Stephen.
Well, I pulled a couple quotes out of the book that have to do with Olcott's view of the skepticism he encountered. So he says, it argues ill for the boasted freedom of opinion among scientific men, he's talking about scientists now, that they have so long refused to institute a scientific investigation into the existence and nature of facts asserted by so many competent and credible witnesses, and which they are freely invited to examine when and where they please. For my own part, I too much value the pursuit of truth and the discovery of any few facts in nature to avoid inquiry because it appears to clash with prevailing opinions, which is kind of a long way to say that if they're scientists and their business is to, explore and uncover the truth, then why aren't they doing it, So then he talks about Sir William Crookes. He says, when Mr. Crookes announced in 1870 his intention to take up this new branch of scientific inquiry, his determination was applauded by the most influential journals in Europe. Now, they said, we shall have the facts, for now a truly great student of nature is set about finding it all out. But when he found it out and announced, the honest and brave man that he is, that his researches warranted the belief that spiritual intercourse was a demonstrable truth, he was abused and vilified to such a degree as to make it apparent that what he was expected to discover was something that would not run counter to popular prejudice. In other words, we love objectivity when it yields what we already believe in.
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't want any of that objectivity that challenges our worldview.
Yes, the comfort zone that we've built up around ourselves, certainly the scientists of the day. Now, it's interesting, you mentioned William Crookes, and I talked about him in part one with the materializations of Katie King. Now, William Crookes, he was an inventor of his day. He was very, very well known and highly respected. I think he invented the cathode ray tube or something, the vacuum tube, as being one of his inventions. He was a very, very clever guy for his day. And so, this is why they applauded him being the guy that would go out and expose this fraudulency.
Right.
And he became
he was a real scientist. Unfortunately.
Yeah. And when he'd actually write to other scientists or invite them and say, look, come down and see for yourself these materializations. And they said, no, they won't. They just completely refused to come down and witness it for their own eyes. And the thing was, it's like, if they did, they'd have to admit that it was true. Yeah. And they could not afford to risk that reputation, you see.
Which is bizarre, because that's the opposite of scientific inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is why today that it's still, people say there's no such thing as life after death. Because if they had listened to Crookes and people had come as requested, then that would be what all these skeptics want. They want at least 4 or 5 scientists agreeing that they've seen this on the old side.
That is part of the scientific method, isn't it?
Yeah.
The peers, the community of peers,
peer-reviewed stuff,
replicating the experiment and signing off on it, as a community. So that should have happened a long time ago.
Yeah, and it's only because of science that we've still kind of stuck with this kind of worldview of that there's no such thing as life after death.
Well, religion wouldn't have anything to do with it. Science wouldn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
Both sides.
Yeah, I mean, spiritualism's got a hard challenge to prove itself, and it's only the ones that are kind of open-minded, and it literally is being open-minded and sort of say, well, let's look into this. And Crookes was a brave man to do that, and he said it. But 30 years after the events of that time when he was looking into Katie King and investigating spiritualism and finding out that she indeed existed as a separate entity beyond the body of Florence Cook, the medium, he actually said, I still stand by my findings 30 years ago. By this time, he was a very old man. And he said, I still stand behind that 100%, And he was still friends with the medium when she actually passed away. He wrote a letter to the family to sort of say how sorry he was to hear, that Florence Cook had passed away. And, so he always sort of stood with that. And he was a brave and honest guy to do that. It's quite incredible, really, to sort of come forward and actually stand his ground against them,
Mm-hmm.
He never, unfortunately, was around at the time during the Second World War where he could have potentially investigated the mediumship of Scottish medium Helen Duncan, who was actually committed to trial during World War II.
She was persecuted,
as well by the war cabinet, if you like, of Winston
Well,
Churchill.
because she said it was a sinking ship that she had seen, and it was a secret, right?
That's right.
So she wasn't supposed
That's
to
right.
know that.
Yeah, basically,
So she became a threat to national security.
That's right. She was a wartime medium. She was from Scotland. She did a lot of her seances in Portsmouth, which is the home of the Navy in the UK. And she would have these seances in this upstairs room somewhere, and sailors would materialize, and they'd be wearing their
they drowned,
HMS Raleigh or HMS whatever it was on their caps, and and of course the Admiralty wanted to keep it secret. They did not want the British to know about the sinking of their own ships because they thought it'd destroy morale. And here, but the word was getting around that these sailors were coming back and reporting it, so they pounced on her basically, and they put her away for the rest of the war under I think they did it under the accusation of the witchcraft trials, which were old laws that they could pull out. You know, it was the only thing they had at the time. And one time she was exposed. I think it was she was exposed to light when they switched on the lights to try and accost her and take her away or something. And she became very ill, and she never really fully recovered from that. But I remember reading on the website, which I think was put up there by her granddaughter. A friend of mine, Ben, has actually he's appeared on our show quite a few times. He's actually been in touch with the granddaughter, and he's done talks on Helen Duncan himself. But one of the eyewitness reports had written a letter, and they said, look, you can publish this on your website or wherever you want. And it was basically saying that they was at one of the demonstrations of mediumship she did, and she produced a Scottish Highland piper from behind the curtain. And he came out with bagpipes in a full Scottish headdress and everything, but complete with a pony. A full-bodied pony. And he said the pony nodded like that, as ponies do, he said. And you're thinking, she was accused of having two stomachs, that she had like swallowed monthly and somehow regurgitate it like a cow.
It's really hard to get a pony out of your
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how on earth can you regurgitate a Highland piper with bagpipes and a pony?
And the pipes will stick you, you know, they tend to poke out, you know.
But you see, this is it. And again, she offered to prove herself, because obviously she was on trial. She offered to the judge that I'll demonstrate my mediumship. What I'm doing is not false. It's not witchcraft. It's true mediumship. And she was prepared to demonstrate it in the court. And they actually, for a small time, so I say small time, for a medium, that she's being charged with like forgery or fakery or something like that, they actually took this case to the Old Bailey, which is like one of the most important courts in the land in the UK. It's where they do murder trials and things, you know. It's still around today, the Old Bailey. It's where they do the big stuff, you know. And yet, this is basically forgery, an accusation of forgery. And they were trying her at the Old Bailey. And I think what they were doing was a deliberate making it big national news as a warning to any other mediums that were thinking of trying this kind of stuff. And I think it was put there as literally to sort of say, don't try this at home, kind of stuff, you know. But she did continue after the war. She carried on producing a lot, but unfortunately, because she was exposed to light during a seance, it did affect her. And I think basically she became quite ill and eventually died.
Why does that affect them? What is it with light and mediumship?
Well, I understand that the ectoplasm is sensitive to the frequency of daylight. It can be seen under dim lighting conditions, or where curtains are drawn, or under infrared light, which has got a different frequency in itself. In fact, when you think about it, when you used to develop film in a dark room, you could look at the film safely under an infrared light without...
So it's a little bit like photography and developing...
Yeah, it does seem to be a sensitive thing. Having said that, you know, all these mediums would do it in the darkness. There was a medium in Brazil, I think in the 1900s, who was tested by the government of Brazil at the time. I forget his name off the top of my head, but he was producing phenomena like afternoon tea parties in gardens, you know, in full daylight. And these spirits would appear in the sky, and they would just come and land on the lawn in a tea party or something, you know.
You remember the name? I'd love to investigate that.
Mirabelli, I think it is.
Okay.
He was born in Brazil, of Portuguese heritage, I believe, and he started work as a guy working in a shoe shop, but his colleagues didn't like him too much because he had strange, starey eyes, apparently. And when he used to walk out the shoe shop, shoe boxes used to follow him home, float down the street, allegedly. So they reported him to the authorities, or something, and he was like arrested. Something. He was taken to a mental asylum where the doctors at the mental asylum, because they thought he must be crazy, they started to study him, and they studied the phenomena or something. They said, no, you're not mental, but you've got something of great interest. Basically, I'm paraphrasing what they came up with. And so it came to the attention of the president of Brazil, and they formed a committee. And over something like 3 or 4 years, they studied Mirabelli's abilities. Carmine Mirabelli, I think it might be. I'll send you some info on him so you can take a closer look. But there's a guy that I know. He's done a report on him on YouTube, which I got some screenshots for my own presentation.
He was able to get around the light problem. He was able.
Yeah, it seemed to be perfectly okay for him. Now, I got a theory on that, but I don't know. It's only a theory. I'm not a scientist or anything like that. Now, I spoke to one of our previous guests who reported that his wife materialized in bed 8 years after her death. He found her in his bed, and he said it was dark in the room, but he could feel her body. He could feel her tummy, her legs. He knew without a shadow of doubt it was his wife. He felt her body. He knew it was her in the bed. And she was there for a few minutes, and then she faded away. And he said that he looked up charts the next day of the weather and stuff like that, and he found that there was like a solar storm or something that that night had kind of hit the Earth, which is where particles of radiation or whatever from the sun come out in a big plasma, and
so
they hit
maybe
the
those
Earth.
Particles make it easier to.
Well, yeah, I said, it sounds like she surfed in on the energy or something. And he says, yeah. So now around the Earth, we have the Van Allen radiation belts. I don't know if you know of those. That's discovered by James Van Allen. Basically, during the late 50s, he was a scientist that discovered these belts. And what they are, they're trapped particles of radiation from the sun. But because we got a magnetic core of the Earth, it traps the particles in the magnetic field around the Earth. So think of a bar magnet. When you put a bar magnet under a piece of paper, you put violins, it kind of forms patterns. And it's a similar thing. It traps the particles of radiation, and that actually acts as a shield. Ironically, it acts as a shield and stops further radiation coming in and hitting us. It filters most of it out. And the only areas that you'll see radiation hit the Earth is where the particles interact with the North Pole and the South Pole. We call it the Aurora Borealis, you see.
Okay.
So that's where you can kind of see it in action, physically speaking. So, but there is what they call an anomaly, which is called the South Atlantic anomaly, where the radiation dips down. It happens to dip down over the whole area of Brazil and South America. Okay. And instead of being like 600 miles to 1,000 miles above the Earth in these belts, it dips down to maybe 100 miles just above, so it's a lot lower, this radiation. So I'm wondering, and it's only speculative, I haven't done any investigations. I'm just trying to put 2 and 2 together, and maybe that might explain it. That if based upon our guest that had his wife materialize and she came in when there was charged particles from a solar storm, maybe the radiation had something to do with it. And maybe this radiation that's appearing over the South Atlantic anomaly over Brazil, might explain why there's lots of things like psychic surgery, lots of psychics, lots of UFOs.
Yeah, Brazil is really pretty.
It's a bit of a hotspot for that kind of stuff. Yeah,
seems to be.
So my theory, hypothesis, if you like, is that maybe this South Atlantic anomaly might some way be involved in that, but I can't scientifically explain exactly how, why, because obviously scientists are not really examining manifestations, are they? Yeah, not that we know of. I mean,
well, some of them are, but I think they keep it quiet.
Yeah.
So in the Eddy manifestations, there was no mention of ectoplasm that I saw in the book. These people just came out of the cabinet.
Yeah.
There were a couple instances where they were running out of energy and they started to melt into the floor.
Right.
We have Honto fully animated, melting into the floor, and then going back into the cabinet, and then after a few minutes, she comes back out and she's re-energized. So there's clues like that. There's that you could start to develop theories as to how, supposing we get past the question of was it happening or wasn't it happening. That's been done, already. So now how is it happening? That's the question. How are they doing it? So the question is, there's no ectoplasm apparently. They just come out fully formed. They can melt. It does have something to do with energy, because when the energy gets low, somehow they start to lose it. And also there was some descriptions of how the spirit would let somebody touch them. This one lady let this one lady put her hand on the spirit's chest, and it felt kind of cold and clammy. And it was colder and sweatier than normal, colder than a normal person. It felt physical, but it didn't quite feel natural. So there's some little clues like that. I don't know how to put those clues together, but it seems like if you go through and you kind of add them all up, you would have some kind of pointers as to how are they doing this.
Yeah.
So he has a couple of theories. One of them is that it's just they're influencing, like controlled hallucinations. They're influencing the people's minds. But that doesn't work when you get, like, they're touching somebody and they're measuring them and they're getting their pulse, because they measured their pulse. And the pulse was there, but it was kind of on the weak side, I think, if I remember correctly. So there are clues in there, and if you put them all together, they might get a sense. One of the things he said is they're like pulling these particles out of the atmosphere as opposed to extruding. So
yeah, I think by certainly the description of melting into the floor, that kind of bears resemblances to other descriptions of other seances where Gordon Higginson, a very well-known English medium, passed away in the 90s. I had the privilege of seeing him do demonstrations of mental mediumship when I first started to explore this stuff. An amazing medium doing mental mediumship. He used to give
I've seen him on YouTube.
Yeah. He used to give out door numbers, phone numbers, could walk around your house, mentally. He could see everything, He picked out this guy that was at the front of the audience that night that I was there, and he said, you, the coat that you're wearing tonight is not the coat you originally came out in. He said you actually came out and you sat in your car and you had a different coat on, and you decided that coat was not for you. So you went back into your house, you threw your coat on the bed, and you took the coat out of the cupboard that you've now got on, and you wore that here tonight. And he's going, like,
it's just a coincidence.
Yeah, just a coincidence, just guessing. But then he went further. He said, my helpers, in other words, the helpers on the other side, have gone down, because this was in a place that had a multi-story car park below it. He said they've gone down now to the car park 3 or 4 levels below, and they've found your car, and they've come back and told me that the registration number of your car is PYE something 2ZK or whatever.
That impresses me.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
And the guy was going, yeah, absolutely. He couldn't quite get 2 letters of the registration number, but the rest he got,
That's pretty serious.
That's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, everyone was open mouth, and at the end of it, you knew this guy was good because everyone wanted to touch him like he was God or Jesus or something.
Yeah. Well, on YouTube, you can see a bunch of them, but I've seen Gordon Smith on YouTube, and he got first, middle, and last name of person and spirit, all 3 accurate, with no guessing,
Yeah.
So, I had that experience myself, because I used a medium to try to get in touch with my past life wife, Abby, back in 2010. I used 2 different ones. And the second one, it was like he wasn't really coming up with evidential stuff. And right at the end, he says that, my past life is Matthew, right? So he says, I hear M, Matthew, and then he says Methuen. I couldn't quite understand him. But what I wish I could clarify with him, but I'm pretty sure what he was saying was a town called Methuen, which is right next to where they grew up. It also happens to be pretty darn close to the church he worked out of, and he had no idea who he was reading. So I think when he heard Methuen, he said, well, that's just the town next door. I've got to be making that up. He's thinking to himself, because there's only one town in the United States named Methuen, and it's right, not far from Swampscott, where he was working out of.
Yeah.
So, but he didn't know that. What it meant is Abby was telling me we lived in Methuen, which I didn't know. He didn't know that. I didn't know that. I only found it out later. I was able to prove it later, that for like a month they lived with his second cousin in Methuen, right? So there's an example where it can't be ESP, and it's so obscure, there's no way he could possibly. In other words, he could have looked me up online, theoretically, while he's talking to me, but he wouldn't have known that, because I didn't know that. It's not anywhere.
That's it. Yeah. Well, Gordon Smith was, Gordon Higginson, they're all called Gordons or Dorises for some reason. But Gordon Higginson was absolutely phenomenal in that kind of thing. That he would get names and phone numbers, car registration plates, and everything.
Yeah.
And as a kid, he was doing this sort of thing. And he told a story. He said that when he was a kid, his mother used to make him do demonstrations of mediumship in a spiritualist church, and he was so small that she used to stand him on it like a box, like a tea chest, because he was like 6 years old or something. He'd be doing reading at the age of 6 years old, and he said that one time this car pulled up, and it's a typical mob mentality. Someone from this car got out and threw a brick through the window, whilst he was demonstrating. It smashed. And he said it frightened the hell out of him. But his mother said, "Carry on, don't stop." So he had to carry on doing this demonstration and her readings while someone was throwing a brick through the window and absolutely terrified the living daylights out of him. I mean, it must have rocked his mind a little bit, but he carried on doing the thing, But that was exactly what happened to the Eddies. As kids, they were driven out of towns when they would do their song. They would nearly escape tarring and feathering, I understand.
That's right.
Thing. So they were just as hounded. But what I was going to say, Gordon Higginson, he also did physical mediumship as well. And again, the ectoplasm would come out of his nostrils. And lots of times, the spirits would be seen to dissolve into the floor. So when in the Eddy farmstead, the spirits were seen to dissolve into the floor, suggests to me that maybe there was some physical mediumship of the ectoplasm type kind anyway. But maybe because they're behind the curtain,
it happened behind the curtain.
Yeah, you just can see it manifesting. Various theories have been put forward to that. One is that if you ever think of the film The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, where you see the alien creature morphing out the dog and it looks pretty grotesque as it's morphing into various shapes. Well, someone put forward the theory that maybe you seeing a human being morphing out of something would look pretty disgusting or whatever until it's fully filmed as a person, and it might be too upsetting for the average person, so they do it behind the curtain.
No, it makes perfect sense to me.
And it does. But the other side of that coin is that they say that that's to help build up the energy anyway, in a closed area. And it sort of suggests a similar thing at the back of the cave of Hontos Cave, where there's between the two rocks, they can build up that energy. And my mum saying that, her mother was in the doorway, which I suspect acts as kind of portals. So I wonder, these closed spaces act as kind of portals to build up the energy, and then they can step out for a limited period of time, walking around in our atmosphere.
This is the science of the future,
Yes.
not to be dealing, it's the same thing in reincarnation. It's not, does it exist or not? It exists. But no, let's look at it. How does it work? What are the parameters? What are the, required, what are the requirements for it to happen? How does it work,
Yeah, and why? That's where we start getting into the Theosophical societies and things that Olcott went on to form with Madame Blavatsky.
And why isn't it happening all over the place? Why is it just a few people, or is it? Or are there a lot of other people doing it and they just don't want to admit it,
I think that is. I mean, there's a lot of natural mediums out there that have probably just turned away from it. I mean, I remember I used to listen to radio shows, LBC, London Broadcasting Centre or something it was called, LBC. It's still going today. But they used to have these phone-in shows in the 1980s, and I used to listen to them late at night on the headphones and drift off to sleep. And they used to have this guy that they used to have, they'd talk about ghostly stuff, and obviously that was of interest to me. And so I used to listen to it, and people used to phone in with their stories. And one guy said that, he was in his house, and he was only a young guy, if I recall. He would see mist coming from under the door, and he was asking, I think, the guest who was on the show, what it could be. He saw this mist come through under the door, and he was really scared, and he didn't know what to make of it. And the guest, who I think was a psychic or a medium or something, was saying, it sounds like that you're a natural medium, and that mist is possibly something like ectoplasm starting to form, and it's coming under the door somehow. You're forming it, or with the help of spirits, but you don't realize it. They're trying to let you know that they're working with you, perhaps, or something was implied. And there was another guy that phoned in. He was a regular caller apparently, because the DJ or the presenter kind of knew him very well, and he says, "Oh, it's so and so that's calling in today." And they were talking about ghosts and that. And this guy said that his own father's face just appeared out of the wall one time. And he sort of looked down at him. And this guy said, "What do you want with me?" or something. He said, "Why have you come back to me?" It's like, I can't remember what the answer was, but he said his father was, he'd come through the wall and was looking down at him. Kind of spooky, especially when you're hearing that late at night on the radio.
Yeah.
It's your mind going in places you don't want to think of,
But how many people are there out there having experiences like that? That just, you don't know.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
never tell anybody.
Yeah. I mean, I hear snippets from different people, I mean.
Because if they tell anybody, they'll be ostracized completely.
Yeah. I mean, I knew a lady
Child.
in the 90s. She said her son came home one day, empty house. The son was a teenager. He came home to find what he described as like a falconer's glove, with falconries. Yeah, with a glove that protects the hand. It was just floating in midair above the coffee table in the living room when he came home and just saw it there. I don't know how long it was there for, but he described it back to his mum, who was into this kind of stuff, whereas the son wasn't. And apparently it seemed like the son had these natural abilities. But I don't know whatever happened to him, whether he went on or develop it. I suspect he probably didn't. He probably wanted to get away from that sort of thing. Maybe it's not the right time.
How do you set limits with spirits? In terms of like, for example, I understand that people recommend not to use the Ouija board. And I think the reason is that because people use it, they make a general invitation. Anybody's around, even like if you're a murderer or a criminal, doesn't matter, anybody come in, and then the wrong people come in and they get attached and they won't go away. And, but I mean, it seems like there have to be spirits on the other side that are making the glove appear, there's somebody else, interacting. So how do you set limits?
Like that's right. Yeah. Because they're intruders, essentially. They're intruding into your day-to-day reality, trying to attract your attention. But maybe, you could go to the argument that, well, you incarnated reincarnational style into this life. That was your plan to be a medium or to develop these gifts. And these are just little reminders, little wake-up calls for you.
It's my understanding, I could be wrong about this, but it's my understanding that you have to give an invitation somehow before you'll start to get manifestations like that. In some way you have to say, I want to see this, or anybody out there or something. And I think you have to be, I'm just guessing because I'm not really psychic, but I think you have to be careful about what kind of implied or explicit invitations you put out there.
I suppose that might be right. Although the Eddies as children seem to just be getting stuff.
Right.
I never even thought about inviting spirits. They were just there, like their grandmother, for instance. She just kept appearing and eventually became more solid, which is interesting. Going back to the seances they were producing, some people reported they could see fully materialized beings. On other occasions, maybe the power wasn't so great. They could actually see more translucent people. Which would suggest that they may be not physical materializations made of ectoplasm, but they might be like their astral bodies walking.
Right. Well, that's what Matt Fraser says. He can see, people on the other side.
Yeah.
Kind of around the people he's reading, he can see them.
Yeah. Which gets me into the fake mediumship things that I've been involved in. Although obviously believe in this stuff, unfortunately I have to go through a lot of pain and misery trying to sort out the wheat from the chaff. I'm sure a lot of other researchers have done the same, and I went to demonstrations where supposedly the medium's tied up in this cabinet, and he was bringing his guide through, who was a guy that died in the 1980s, who was an East End Cockney guy. But when we heard his voice speaking through the curtain or the cabinet, he sounded very Irish. He sounded almost like Dumbledore. He sounded like the actor Richard Harris to me, with a very Irish accent going on there, sort of thing, And I thought, well, how can that be a Cockney? I mean, I wasn't aware he was meant to be Cockney until after the seances. When I spoke to the medium's wife, I was sort of asking questions. And so anyway, they said that William, that was his name, was going to now, he felt confident enough that he could perhaps materialize his hand under the curtain for everybody to see. And so I was in this seance room, and I was in the aisle seat, and I could see the curtain, and the medium was sort of tied up behind it, apparently, and taped up and everything like that. But unbeknownst to me, it's only afterwards that I realized the medium's brother was sitting at the front, in the front seat, and the medium's wife was also sitting in the front seat. And I think her job was operating the CD player for music to play, to enhance the vibrations or something. But I was in a good position, I think, because I was in the aisle seat. So I had the ability to lean right down on my right-hand side, but no one there. I could almost look under the curtain a bit, and they had these infrared lights on. And I heard someone in the semi-darkness say, "Oh, that hand's dematerializing." So I was looking down like this. There's a weird angle to try and see. And I could see this arm coming out and waving under the curtain. And then it was sliding back. But it wasn't dematerializing at all. I suddenly saw it go up like that. Just lifting up. And I thought, that's not dematerializing. And so then they said, the spirits said, they invited a man from the front to go over and shake hands with this materialized hand. It was just coming out like the curtain had lifted maybe half a foot off the floor. The rest of it was covered. And so the hand was poking out just below. Right. And so this guy from the front went out and he went to grab both ends of the curtain to lift the whole thing up. And quickly the wife said, "No, don't lift up the curtain." And he goes, "Oh, sorry, he said." So he just shook hands with the curtain with the hand. Right. And then the spirit hand went away. And then after that, they said, "Right, we think that everyone can now come and shake hands with this spirit hand." So we all had to get into a queue and line up one behind the other and go up and literally shake hands with this materialized hand. And I went up and I saw this hand. It looked very human to me. And I shook hands. I felt the grasp. It didn't feel cold. It didn't feel clammy. It felt warm. It felt like a human hand. And I thought, I think this is fakery. I'm absolutely certain of it. But I was told, shook the hand and everything. The thing is, we were all searched prior to us going into this room. And afterwards, I spoke to the medium's wife when it's all finished. And she said that Jonathan was a market trader who used to trade, fruit and veg selling in the market. And he came home and was killed by 2 burglars in his house. And that's how he died. But he was from the East End of London. And I said, his voice sounds very Irish to me. And she goes, "Really? I didn't notice that." And I'm thinking, surely you could notice it was an Irish accent, And it became apparent that the medium himself was from Ireland. And so the guy's brother was Irish as well. Now, during the seance, there was these drums being played really well, I might add. But there was like a little drum kit because it was a Christmas tree seance. It was like a little drum kit and presents and things by this Christmas tree in the corner of the room. And during the darkness, the drums being played really well. So then I thought, well, in Ireland, they have something called the Boys Brigade or something, where they teach these kids to march up and down in a uniform and they teach them to play the drums really well. It's not out of the realms of possibility that this bloke in the audience, a brother, could be playing those drums and he learned to play it as a youngster in the Boys Brigade or something, or just could play the drums really well. I thought the fact that he was right near the drum set, sitting at the front thing, I couldn't rule out that could have been played by him. And at the very end, the medium went off and we all went into the next room and having a cup of tea and biscuits and everyone was sort of talking about it. And I'm sort of still thinking, I think I've been defrauded here. And I thought, okay, if I ever went again, because I had to pay like £30 to do this, and you have to write a letter and say you're coming. Yeah. So I thought, if I ever went again, obviously I'm going to be checked for recording devices, cameras, anything like that. How could I check that it's a fraud or something? So I thought, okay, if I went again, because I'm an artist, I do oil paintings, and oil paints take a long, long time to dry. What I would do was take a tube of red oil paint, and I'd sit in the car before I went into the seance room, and I would squeeze a little bit of red oil paint onto my finger and then put an elastoplast over it. So it looks like I've got an injured finger, basically. But it's under it, it's the oil paint being protected. And so when they'd call everyone up to go and shake hands with the mysterious Jonathan, I would make sure I'd be the last in the queue. And then I'd go up there and peel off this plaster and I'd get the oil paints on my thumb and rub it all over this materialized hand, because that way, if it's genuine spirit, it would just dematerialize and there'd be no problem at all. But the thing is, you can't wash off oil paint with water. You'd need something, ironically, called white spirit to remove it as thinners. And so literally, you'd look around the room afterwards where they're having their tea and biscuits.
Oh, he'd be hiding.
The guy.
Yeah, have his hand in his pocket.
Yeah, and I'll say, I've caught you red-handed, literally.
Yeah. Awesome, yeah.
So, yeah, and then I've seen another guy closer to here in Portland, here in Weymouth, where he was a guy from the north of England who had come down the train and he brought his own materialization cabinet and he was going to go into trance and stuff. And he was doing all these silly voices. He was doing Louis Armstrong and all singing. He couldn't actually sing in time with his own tune. They actually played the Louis Armstrong "It's a Wonderful World," and he was supposedly Louis Armstrong was coming through his voice, channeling him, but he couldn't actually sing in time to his own tune, which I thought was a bloody irony. And then he spoke in the voice of a spirit guide, and he said they're playing, I think it was "My Sweet Lord" by George Harrison, the Beatle, and he said, now in our next bit, the spirit of John Lennon and George Harrison will come out into the audience and mingle with you in the darkness and touch you, but you won't be able to see them, but you might feel George Harrison or John Lennon touch you on the shoulder as we play the music, And I thought, well, that's bloody stupid. How on earth, can you prove it's George Harrison or John Lennon coming out into the circle? Someone might touch on the shoulder, but it could be one of his helpers, Confederates as they call them. There's just no way, unless you got a red light on them, can you see who it is anyway? It was just complete darkness. I thought that's just such a stupid statement to make, And then at the end, he was allowing the lights to be turned on, and he allowed the curtain to be lifted up. And you could see this guy in trance. And he's supposedly now doing Winston Churchill. And he's doing a very bad Winston Churchill impersonation. It was really awful, so bad. I remember sitting next to this lady in the evening, and I said afterwards, well, what do you think of it? She goes, I thought it was absolutely rubbish. And I said, yeah, I have to agree with you. It's terrible, And I was asked to write a report on this because this lady who had organised it, I sort of said, well, I've been to a few of these things before. She goes, oh, could you write a report of it, please, to say what you think of it? So I said, well, okay. So I wrote a report of it, but it didn't go down too well. I was given I thought, well, I can only say what I see, I wasn't convinced by it. And this is the reasons why. And I went through all these bullet points of why I thought the whole thing was fake. So yes, I do believe this stuff happens. There is a very rare phenomenon, but this guy was just totally deluded. And I even went on the internet and looked up a little bit about this guy to find out his history and reports from other circles. And other people commented, yeah, he's a nice guy, but he's just completely deluded. He thinks he's in touch with all these spirits. And he deludes himself. Yeah, he convinced himself. And the trouble is he had a bit of an ego about him, because when we got there, he turned up by himself, I think. He might have had helpers, I don't know, but it appeared to be by himself. But he was putting these great big posters on every door around the room saying, whatever his name was, international medium, and it had his picture. It's like a poster here, a poster there. And like at the end of the Gordon Higginson demonstration, when I saw him in the late 80s, everyone wanted to go up to him and touch him because this guy's God, he gave so many brilliant readings that night. When we all came down from this demonstration, when this guy came down, nobody wanted to talk to him. It was all quiet. Everyone just put their coats on and quietly left.
So he's the only one that was fooling himself, but it wasn't fooling anybody else.
Yeah, it was really, I mean, we had a cup of tea in that, but it was polite chatter, but no one was like thinking, hey man, that's fantastic. I think everyone was thinking they've been completely frauded here. It was terrible.
I ran across one that I was able to bust, and she was supposed to be a psychic medium. So she was going to draw me a picture of my past life wife, the same one I was trying to get in touch with the others. And she came up with this picture that didn't look right to me. So then I got online and I Googled woman portrait, and there it is. It's a portrait in the London Museum.
So she copied it?
She copied it. Yeah. I mean, it's so close. It's obvious. I've still got it. It's no question which one she copied. So I told her, I said, all you've done is copy this from a museum. If you give me my money back, I won't expose you. So she did.
Oh, really? Oh my God.
Because it's so close. I mean, it's so obvious, And so all she did was to Google the same thing I did, woman, portrait. And it's like in the first couple of pages. Yeah.
Wow. Oh my God.
Not very smart of her. Yeah.
Yeah. I must admit, I mean, again, we went, this is about 4 years ago now, we went to this demonstration at clairvoyance, the local spiritualist church, and they had this psychic artist come along, and we thought, this would be interesting, let's see how this goes, and she came along with an easel and a big sketch pad, and she announced to everybody, she says, now, before I came here tonight, I felt that I was in tune with someone and I was being given some impressions, so I've drawn a picture of this person, and I want to see if anyone can recognize it. Now, my girlfriend and I are both artists, so we're interested in the art side of it, especially. So
Right.
she lifts up the first page, I think, to reveal this portrait, and it was the worst goddamn drawing we've ever seen. It's like a child that did it, and we're kind of nudging each other saying, what do you think of that thing? And we didn't know where to look, and no one could take it. And she goes, can no one take it at all? And no one could recognize it. It's such a bloody awful drawing.
Even if it had been genuine, you wouldn't have been able to recognize
But that's it. Yeah.
it's so bad.
So
That's funny.
again, they delude themselves. But then on the other hand, I have seen a really incredible psychic artist,
Haven't you? Yeah.
Bill Forrester, who did some fantastic work. Apparently, he was a fan of World War II planes, and he would do paintings of them. And he would even paint the pilots in them. And what would happen is that people would recognize the faces of the pilots, saying, that's my father, or that's my so-and-so. And you're thinking, well, what? I don't know how I'm getting that, And that's how his mediumship into doing this psychic art developed, And so, but he was drawing, he'd do about 5 or 6 drawings in a night of a demonstration, and every one of them would be claimed by people. I was there when it happened,
Yeah, I'd love to see that. Yeah.
He was doing the readings at the same time. He would be talking about someone's going to court and they're doing this, and as he's drawing it. So it's quite a tricky task, not only to give the reading, but be doing a really accurate drawing. I actually went on a workshop of his to try, because people say, "Oh, Neil, you're an artist. You must be able to do psychic art." And I said, "Well, not really. I mean, I can paint and draw quite well, but I'd never really ventured into the psychic art, but I thought, well, I'd give it a go." But I went there and I did stuff, but I didn't really feel I was doing anything spectacular, But I feel that I've got some sort of ability in the psychic field anyway to be able to do readings. Whether I eventually end up doing psychic art is another
great
matter.
if you could do it.
If I could do it, that'd be great, yeah. I haven't really practiced it much. I mean, I'm having enough time and trouble trying to sort of do what I'm doing anyway with.
Well, you've got to get that connection with the helpers,
Yeah, something to build upon, I think. Yeah, I'm looking to get back into another circle, so I think that eventually will happen at a time and a place, and it will start to settle down, and I can start to get into really serious practice maybe later this year. With everything that's been happening the past 2 years, it's been upsetting for everybody in lots of different ways with life, and everyone's having to do stuff over Zoom or Skype or whatever like that.
Right.
Now we're coming back into the world a bit more. We can try and resume these activities, hopefully, Anyway, I think on that note, I think we better draw this chat, very interesting chat, I might add, to a close. It's getting late here now in the UK, but I know it's late afternoon for you.
It's dinner time.
Yeah, it's dinner time, so it's probably a good time to close this interesting discussion. Any final words before we go, Stephen?
Well, the thing that kept striking me was, if there's evidence for some of these phenomena, a lot of evidence, and then one person comes along and says, "Oh, it's been debunked," don't assume that the debunker is authentic, because the debunker may be the fraudulent one very often. I mean, this happened in the Bridie Murphy case. It's apparently happened with some of these other psychics. And even Olcott assumes that the debunkers were real. And what he takes away from it is, oh, well, some of these psychic mediums will cheat occasionally. I don't think that's what it is. I don't think they cheated at all. I think the person that claimed they debunked them were phonies.
Yes. Yeah.
So keep that in mind.
Yeah. And that reminds me of James Randi, the magician.
Sure.
Late James Randi, who hated psychics, wanted to expose them. He was the Houdini of the 20th century, if you like, or the 21st century, who was out to expose psychics. And
but Houdini got a message from his wife, from Arthur Ford. So Houdini did have a real.
Yes, he did, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yes. Because he was the one that was exposing mediums back in the day, of course.
Right.
But James Randi, although he was, I think he was American or Canadian, I'm not sure which. I thought he came from Canada myself.
I don't remember.
Yeah, but he was kind of well known here as well, and they invited him to have his own TV show, James Randi Investigates or something like that. And I did see some episodes back in the 80s. And there was a well-known medium at the time, a Welsh medium, very, very accurate medium called Stephen O'Brien. And I read his book. I actually saw him live a few times as well, but I read his book, and he said that he appeared on this James Randi show. And he was giving messages, he was asked to give messages, and he was getting everything. He was getting all the hits and stuff. And he said that James Randi apparently didn't like it. So he said, stop the recording,
Oh,
they edited that bit out where he was getting hits. They edited it out because James Randi didn't like it. And so...
and he was offering $1 million or something.
Yeah,
to anybody that could prove,
Yeah, and that has been challenged as well, apparently.
That's a nice scam. You just don't admit the ones that were genuine.
Yeah, I mean, where people were saying we'll do it, he was avoiding them. Apparently, he wouldn't reply to the emails.
Very convenient. Yeah.
Anyway, I'd like to say thank you very much to Stephen I was going to say Stephen O'Brien. I'm talking about the media. Stephen Sakellarios. And your other self, of course, your former past life. I'll say good night to him as well. If he's listening, if that's such a thing possible. Good night to Matthew. So thank you very much for joining us on the Paranormal Peep Show. And if you're doing any projects, can people find out about that?
Yeah, I've got a new website now. It's easier to remember. It's reincarnationproof.com.
Okay, so if you want to check out Stephen's work, go to reincarnationproof.com and find out about his previous life as well. And maybe you might put more stuff, your later research on there as well, including maybe discussions of what we've been having as well, going into the Eddy brothers and materializations and things like that. But it's been certainly an interesting discussion. I'm going to carry on reading the book. I suggest that if you're interested in this, anybody that's out there, look it up. It's called People from Another World, and it's Colonel Olcott that wrote the book. You can get it on Amazon as a downloadable book, PDF type of thing, or whatever they call it, but it's very difficult to read. So we've read it for free online from the archive.org.
Archive.org.
Yeah, so that's where you can find it if you're interested in reading it. Okay, so I'll say thank you very much indeed, and catch us next time. I'm Neil Geddes Ward. Catch us next time on the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Good night.
You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, voted #1 for paranormal podcasts in the UK.